The system has changed, and it has changed drastically, but it gives us indications of what is really going on underneath Santorini, the Columbo underwater volcano, and in that whole area where we've seen this massive earthquake swarm. The non-ending earthquake swarm started January 26th and is still ongoing. We just had another 4.4 today. But what is happening now? It has shifted from, oh, this is only tectonic, don't worry, to it is volcanic, and it's for sure volcanic. And there's possible theories and explanations, and I want to look into this for you today because in my opinion, this is very plausible what has happened. We will have a closer look at the magma chamber underneath Santorini, and they haven't said this. They have known now for almost 13 days that there have been gas emissions at the Nea Kameni. That's this little island that looks completely covered in lava. Sulfur gases that came out of there. But why didn't they say anything? Why did they still say it's all tectonic? This is a big question. So there are a few new graphs that we can look at. The earthquakes overall have become a little less, but the seismic swarm is still ongoing, and it looks like that we're having a magma intrusion or something. Some scientists are saying something is erupting underwater there already. The state of emergency at Santorini has been extended until March 14th from March 3rd, but we also now have state of emergency at Amorgos, of Ios, and in other islands around Santorini, and many residents and tourists have evacuated. I heard some news today that some residents are coming back to Santorini, which I think is absolutely crazy right now. But you know, what is driving this most unusual seismic behavior, and what do the local volcanoes have to do with it? So the scientists, more and more scientists are coming together to find a solution and an explanation for this. The local scientists have said we need help from other scientists from all over the world that have more experience with this kind of phenomenon. We know that we have seen a land rise at Santorini. I've showed you the satellite images and I've showed you the maps where we see that land rise. Definitely we see it at Nea Kameni, but we also see it along the coasts of this ring there at Santorini. So there is a motion in the ground uplift. It's lifting up, and it did lift up rapidly, and it has been rapidly moving to the north and to the northeast in the last days, weeks, and months. And the best data that we're getting are coming from these GPS stations that are stationed on Santorini. You see this map here. These are the 3 stations, and the Sant station is the one that is most important for what we are looking at. And I've got like a bird's eye picture of where this Sant station is. So this is not in some field. It's actually where there's a building. And I've shown you the graph before. So what we have been seeing, the movement up north and east, but we basically also saw, and that is still not solved yet, why the uplift was going down a little bit. I've explained it to detail in my last video, but you also see that it's rapidly moving to the north and rapidly moving to the east. We'll get back to that. I'd like you to have a look at this picture here. So we know this is a difficult area with a lot of volcanoes, volcanic craters, and a lot of fault lines. Tectonic forces come in play. So how this looks, and this is a good graphic from Dr. Papanikolaou, where he shows us these fault lines. These are like rough surfaces on the ocean, like mountain hills and something like this. So there is a magma chamber, and that magma chamber is filling up, and then the magma chamber puts pressure on everything that's above the magma chamber. So the fluids in the hydrothermal area. So it could be that we have seen a magma intrusion. So underneath the Santorini is this magma chamber, and magma might have gone out of that magma chamber, and the earthquake swarm was indicating where this magma was going. So it could have caused a magma intrusion, and that intrusion could have caused also a migration of fluids that now have reached a high temperature because of the magma. And that of course builds also pressure along the fault lines. And this is basically what they are showing us in this graphic. And you also see there's the Columbo underwater volcano, and there's the Anhydros fault and the Santorini Anafi fault, right? So this is all playing together. And they have also identified that there have been microseismic events already since September last year, and that these microseismic events have progressively migrated from the Santorini caldera towards the northeast, like we see that massive swarm doing right now, doing the same. And basically it started in September until it has reached the current position. And then if we look at all the data together, we could suggest that the magma intrusion that we think is happening right now could be the origin of the event. So maybe this has been happening longer than we think. So that's what we're seeing here. We see a cluster at the Columbo volcano, we see a shallow swarm, and we see a deeper lying swarm. So this could all be connected. We have some earthquakes that were happening at a deeper depth and some earthquakes that are happening at more shallow depth, which could be the magma intrusion. And this is also an interesting graph that we're looking at here. You can see the timeline where all these epicenters went, starting from summer of 2024 to February 2025. So you could see the migration of the epicenters of this earthquake swarm. So look at this graph here again. You've seen it in one of my previous videos. What you can basically see is if you look from January 2024 until around basically July 2024, you can see that everything is pretty straightforward. It's running pretty flat. Nothing really is happening. But then we see things changed. If we look at the transition from July to August, things change rapidly. The sun station started to move east, started to move up, and started to move north. And that has continued until late January this year, 2025. And then it changed all of a sudden again. Then motions did accelerate. It was moving to the east at an accelerated rate. And then it started really escalating towards the north. And this is still strange, the station started moving down. You would think it would still move up. No, it started moving down. And when I saw that, I was like, that doesn't make sense. Usually, okay, if it's moving down, that could be if we have a magma chamber that's full to the fullest extent, and then it sends magma out because it has reached the point of maximum elasticity. Then it subsides. So did this happen here? Did the magma intrusion happen? That's why we saw a dip. We did have a magma intrusion in 2011, 2012 when there was another seismic swarm, and they also had way more GPS stations on the island of Santorini. You see it here in that map, the yellow dots. These were the stations that they had there at this time. Now they only have 3 stations. So there was a magma intrusion happening underneath the Santorini caldera. So when magma is coming up from a deeper depth, and it's coming up into the upper layers, so that's why the ground is moving upwards, and it's also moving in other directions. So that's how you always can say, okay, this is an indication that this is magmatic, that magma's on the move. And again, if you keep watching my channel or have watched my channel over the last 1.5 years, we have seen this multiple times, almost every 1 or 2 months in Iceland, right? Before the eruption and when the eruption happens. So this is clearly, it has happened there in 2011 as well. And they have also found out, I said it in my last video, that the source of the current magma chamber is basically also within the caldera. It's not too far from the 2011 location. Now they have moved it a little bit more south. So you see the two volcanoes here in that map. It's the 2024 it's a little bit more south. They found out that the location is not super accurate, but it is in the middle of the caldera. So what does that have to do with these earthquakes, with this earthquake swarm that is currently happening? Because everyone is still searching for an answer. What is causing this monstrous phenomenon, this weird earthquake swarm? So we had this microseismic event already last year in September, also beneath the Santorini caldera. This is where it started. And then it got calm on January 25th until on January 26th, the current swarm has started. But as you see on these maps, it's not underneath Santorini. There is something happening under Santorini. We see an earthquake or two, but the massive cluster, the swarm, is somewhere else. But when that swarm started, we have seen the land rise underneath Santorini. So the conclusion is it must be somehow connected. So it seems magma was already on the move last year, a smaller intrusion, a smaller movement, which was then replaced by something way bigger that started at the end of January. And that's what we're dealing with right now. But why did the SANT station sink then? Scientists don't know. They think there could be additional movement of magma or tectonic displacement outside of the Santorini caldera. Or could there be multiple magma intrusions? We also know if a magma dike is formed, like we've seen in Iceland, it creates valleys around it. So the land is subsiding around it. So is something like this happening there? So we could have not only one active magma body that is moving, we could have several at the same time. But can we identify them so that we know where exactly they are? No, we cannot, because it's so close together. The EMSC has an interesting graphic that they show us that basically wants to show us this development of that low microseismic activity that happened last year underneath Santorini. So you see this here, and then a swarm that started to flow out of Santorini, and then in red this major cluster. And further right of that graphic you basically see the timeline. So you see there's not much recorded, although it was there in July, but then you see some seismicity below Columbo, some seismicity below Santorini, and then you see that transitional swarm, and then you see the location of the major swarm where they all started coming and hammering, creating so many earthquakes that it's dark red. You can't even make out one single point. The interesting thing is here, we do have the microseismic activity underneath the volcanoes, Columbo and Santorini. And they just found a new magma chamber under Columbo that is filling up gradually, has almost reached the amount that it had when it last erupted. And is that connected with Santorini? It's only 4 miles away from Santorini. So could these two guys, these two volcanoes, be responsible for this or interact with each other? We see a more detailed picture here that shows us the earthquakes around the Columbo craters and the Santorini crater. And Columbo, it's several craters. It's not only one crater. It's one major crater and then a few more craters north of Columbo. And this is basically the swarm until that new one started. So this was the seismic activity from May 1st, 2024 till January 15th, 2025. So starting late June already, a few small earthquakes were detected below Santorini that you see on that graph. And the cluster really started then in the third week of September 2024. And the cluster below Columbo also started in mid-September. And what is the relationship between all this? Because the transitional swarm originated near the Columbo volcano on January 27th. And then it started moving to the northeast. And there's a fault zone. You see it on that map here. You see there's like a deeper lying valley. So it started going into that fault zone that extends until the island of Amorgos. So it was really getting close to Amorgos. They have also declared the state of emergency right now, and they have gotten like rescue personnel on the island to assist people. There you see, that's another picture of this earthquake swarm until February 15th, and we know it has intensified after that as well. So you see how it's traveling, right? How it's going to Amorgos. So now we have the pictures of the earthquakes. What is happening with the earthquakes? Where are they going? So let's assume that magma is the cause, that a magma intrusion is causing this. Are the earthquakes following the magma? Interesting is if we now put both together, if we compare the GPS data with the seismic data, so that we get a broader picture. You remember in Iceland when that magma dike formed, it was 15 kilometers long, and you could see where the earthquakes were. It's like, think about miners that are underneath the earth and they're grinding a tunnel, they're using explosives, heavy machines. You can look underneath the earth, but if you have seismometers on top, you can exactly tell where the miners are, how far they are with their tunnel, because the most rumbling is where they're grinding the new tunnel. And is this the same with this earthquake swarm, with this magma intrusion? Some scientists have said there's a 30-kilometer long magma dike that goes out from Santorini towards Amorgos, 1 kilometer wide, but only like that thick. So they have collected data and they have found out that about 3 million cubic meters did flow out of the magma chamber underneath Santorini. So if we match the map where the earthquakes are with the GPS satellite data of the landrise, and if we would lay them on top of each other, what is the result that we would get from this? There's a correlation. This is what scientists found. There is a correlation. If you look at the graph that was provided from the University of Athens, we look at that, the upward movement, the north and the east, and there is this ditch when it moves downward. And then let's compare it with the earthquake data. You see that below, how this earthquake swarm is traveling from January 1st until they only have it to February 10th. What we notice is the early part of that seismic swarm is different from the part that we're dealing with right now. So it's a more microseismic event at deeper depth, interestingly. Then it was going to the northeast, and it seems that it started to activate some of these fault lines that are at shallower depth. So it wasn't an interaction. Well, you have to imagine if so many fault lines and then magma is shooting through this and lifting up and rumbling. Of course, this can activate fault lines. And then we've seen it all of a sudden, all these magnitude 4 earthquakes, 4.4, 4.9, 4.8, 5.0, 5.2, 5.3, 5.0. They started getting into the 5 range as well. And they were very shallow. So how can we draw a conclusion from this if we look at this? Scientists believe that what we have witnessed here can be divided in multiple stages, probably 3 or 4 stages. And there's 2 scientists that have a very interesting explanation for this. It's Kyle Bradley and Judith A. Hubbard. their conclusion is what I find the most interesting. They're also saying that they think that this seismic crisis can be divided in 3 stages. They think that a land rise caused by magma underneath the Santorini caldera at a very shallow depth started last year in September. And when that happened, it caused the sun station and the other GPS stations on Santorini to quietly move upward and move away from the caldera. So that's basically what happens. It's an inflation. What happens if a magma chamber inflates? So normal volcanic signal. We see that in Iceland. And interestingly, what they're saying this at that time, nobody was worried. They saw this inflation and they saw these microseismic earthquakes, but it was not anything of concern. But then at the same time, Columbo started to rumble. We've seen this on these maps. So earthquakes began to cluster underneath the southern flank of Columbo, that underwater volcano that is off the coast of Santorini. Also, microseismic activity. And then, here it comes. Then this current earthquake swarm started on January 26th. And it appeared not underneath Santorini. It started northeast of Santorini. And then it accelerated, really, really accelerated. We've witnessed this, right? And it was at shallow depth. So it was not deep in the crust. It was in the lower crust. That's why they declared the state of emergency on January 29th in Greece. They thought that this is tectonic, and they started preparing for a 7.7 earthquake again that they had in 1956. People started voluntarily leave the island. There was no, and there still is no official evacuation order. So the scientists believe that this swarm was caused by a magma intrusion, that a magma dike was formed like it was forming in Grindavik in November 2023, very shallow into the lower crust, and that this magma dike then was running to the northeast. So from the magma chamber underneath Santorini and from Columbo to the northeast, and that's why we saw these earthquakes there. So it has always been magmatic from the start. And I said it, guys. I said it from the beginning. I said, this looks like similar to what we see in Iceland, just on a tougher scale. This doesn't look tectonic. And gosh, did we receive some shitstorm for that, guys. But you know me, I'm persistent, right? If I have an opinion, I'm not going away from that opinion. So this earthquake swarm was rumbling and rumbling and rumbling between 3 and 4, over 4, until it finally reached the 5s. So scientists believe that this event could be added on to the existing land rise, the existing inflation that was already happening at Santorini. And that's why the GPS stations were accelerating so rapidly. And that's why it looks different than the event that has happened in 2011 and 2012. It was not comparable. So scientists compared it to this event and said, it's different. What is it? It became clear that now the focus needed to shift from the Santorini caldera to outside the caldera, to that area. And then there were some scientists that said, well, we might be live witnessing the creation of a new volcano. And that's not far-fetched, because if you look at the ground floor there's many extinct old craters, and they are along these fault lines. So they are related. So what does that tell us? If there's so many old craters, of course they have been formed by something. So why wouldn't there be the possibility that a new one could be formed? And then you have to imagine, if magma's on the way and you've got all these fault lines, the old craters, the crust is already brittle. And magma always looks for the way of least resistance. So there was a way for magma to flow around in the crust into all these areas. And the magma, the hot magma that was intruding, of course, heats up the fluids that are above it in the shallow crust, like water and gases. And that all that was pushed into these active fault lines between Santorini and the island of Amorgos. And that's where we've seen the cluster. And by heating these fluids up, the pressure was being increased, right? So you're really shooting this, injecting this into this area with these craters and fault lines with a lot of power. So we have these pressurized fluids, according to the scientists, that migrated into these fault zones, and they decreased the clamping stress of the faults. The faults were locked into each other, but then it's like liquid lubricating this. And that allowed them to begin to slip seismically, right? It's like a rusty screw that you can't take out. But then if you have, what's it called, WD-40, you spray it on there, it goes, tuck, it goes out. And that's what these magmatic fluids did. So that's why we saw these larger earthquakes. Because usually with magma intrusions, it stays in the 2, 3, maybe 4 range, but usually we've seen this in Iceland. 2.7 was already like, whoa. So now we're seeing these high magnitudes, 4, 4.8, 5s. This was because the WD-40 was releasing the stress so that these fault lines could add to the game. They could join the party and started the rumbling. So they slipped, seismically explained. There were these high pre-existing tectonic stresses on these shallow crustal faults. And that's why we saw these larger earthquakes above magnitude 5. And you see it on the graphic behind me. This earthquake swarm, this event, they call it a phenomenon because this is not an isolated area like in Iceland. The magma chamber underneath Svartsengi is causing the rumbling, the intrusion, and the earthquakes. There's so much at play. So at all layers of the crust, because some fault lines go really deep and some volcanic craters are there. So the magma intrusion, so we had shallow depth, we had rumbling at a deeper depth of like 8 kilometers. So it was through the whole sequence of layers that we saw activity. Plus that the events were traveling. Very unique and unusual. So when at first nobody worried, all of a sudden scientists started to like, wait a minute, what is this? And we had to, of course, I said, we have tectonic forces there that are tearing apart some parts of the Aegean crust. If you have pizza dough and you stretch it out, it gets thinner in the middle, and that is what happens here as well. So of course, it makes it easier for stuff to come to the surface. And then the upper crust gets more brittle by this. We know that the 1956 Amorgos earthquake did rupture close to the surface, but its original depth was quite deep. We still don't know, will this earthquake swarm stop and it's all over? Or will it escalate into a higher magnitude earthquake again? Will there be another magma intrusion? Should they all evacuate the islands? Is it safe to come back? It's hard to tell. Nobody knows. That's why they have called for help, but it takes time. One takeaway is they definitely need to monitor the area way more. They have brought in boats and underwater submarine types of machines to scan the seafloor because they were worried that there might be an underwater eruption ongoing already after Friday's freaky seismic event. So they were trying to find something. So I hope we hear soon about any findings. They have installed more seismic stations at Columbo already last year, and they have put up more this year. We don't hear anything about this. I would like to see some graphics. I would like to see what's happening there. What do they measure? So I think over time we will learn more, but it's crazy how it's rumbling everywhere, guys. Campi Flegrei is worrying me now. We were like, are all the beautiful vacation spots blowing up? Like Santorini, Greece, Italy, Campi Flegrei, Naples. There's something going on in Spain, guys. That will probably be my next video. So if you're planning your next vacation, be on the lookout. There could be tsunamis, earthquakes, volcanic eruptions. It's kind of crazy. And that's why I tell you, check out the video here in the end screen. This is something that you should really know. And if you want to support this channel, guys, check out the links in the description of this video. Support me by buying me a coffee or two to keep my engine running so that I can produce more and more of these videos for you, because the volcanoes keep me really, really busy. So links are in the description. If you want to become a member for behind the scenes stuff, click the join button, or also check the link in the description, guys. Thank you so much for watching. Don't forget to leave this a like, and here is the video that you can watch next. You should. Thank you. Bye-bye.